It is afternoon already, so good afternoon everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Licen, and I will be your moderator this afternoon, or at least in this session. This is a session on gender and body perspectives, and although we were scheduled to have 3 presenters, we will only have 2, so they will be that much more insightful and that much more informative. Before we begin, I know it is a difficult task, but I would strongly encourage the 6 poor lonely souls in attendance, if they wouldn't mind, to perhaps consider coming forward a little bit, because otherwise, I have to say, looking from here, the image is a bit tired. So if we can make the room feel a bit more welcoming, that would be great. I also do not anticipate 2 rows of reporters coming in the next few minutes, so feel free to occupy the reserved press room, the reserved press row as well. If anyone asks, I gave you the permission. And so again, given that we only have 2 presenters, Roxane Coche, who's an assistant professor at the University of Florida, as well as a board member at the International Association for Communication and Sport, she will go first, and she will then be followed by Karissa Conrad, who is a doctoral student at Purdue University. Their topics, their approaches to gender and body and sport differs a little bit, but nonetheless, hopefully, they will both be very insightful. We will be a bit lenient when it comes to sticking to the 10-minute limit for their presentations, but I will certainly make sure that we have more than enough time for questions in the end. Thank you very much for coming. Enjoy this session, and Roxane goes first with Dare to Dream, examining major event organizers' banning decisions.
Thank you, Simon. Hey everyone. So, who recognizes this photo? Most people, right? I chose this photo, well-known photo, for one big reason: the 1999 World Cup, Women's World Cup here in the US. The president and CEO of the Women's World Cup in 1999, Marla Messing, who now works for the USTA, said, and I'm just going to read it, "In everything we did, we treated it as a major event. Our choices in this country are stadiums with 5,000 or 10,000 seats, or stadiums with 50,000, 60,000, or 80,000 seats. Once you decide on 5,000 or 10,000 seats, the image of what you're selling is second class. Putting it in small stadiums would have sealed the fate of the tournament. You had to sell the image of a major event. Right away, it was major because it's at giant stadiums in the Rose Bowl." So the reason, when she says that, it's when she was being interviewed about originally the World Cup was supposed to be on the East Coast in small stadiums. That's what FIFA wanted. And the players, and Marla Messing, and some people involved with the organizing committee said, no, you can't do that. We got to sell it as a major event. And what ensued? The most successful event in women's sports of all time to this day, right? There were overall 1,180,000 tickets sold, or something along those lines. The final had 90,000 people in attendance at the Rose Bowl in California, which is still to this day the most attended women's game in any sports ever, right? So, am I sounding like, is the sound okay? I feel like I'm echoing. Does it sound okay for you?
There's like a feedback.
Okay, I'll just sit here maybe. That's going to be better, I think. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. So there we go. 1,194,215 people overall for that World Cup, which is more than the number of people who attended this past summer in France in 2019, right? So I kind of wanted to see and investigate what's happened over the past 20 years in terms of audience and how federations have been selling women's sports compared to men's sports. So I looked at 6 Olympic sports: field hockey, handball, volleyball, soccer, basketball, and rugby. Rugby at the Olympics is rugby 7, but because rugby 15 is much, much more popular, outside of the Olympics, that's rugby 15 is what I included. And so I looked at continental and international events that were organized over the past few years. So I used the latest continental events, so Asia, the latest Asian Cup, the latest in soccer Gold Cup here in North America. And then the two latest events for international competition. So still with the example of soccer, we're talking about the 2014 and 2018 World Cups for men, and the 2015 and 2019 World Cups for women, right? And so we had a total of 101 events because 14 of them were simultaneous. So that means that the men and the women competed at the same time in the same venues. I excluded those, and so we ended up with 87 events in the 6 sports. And it's worth noting that the 14 events incidentally came from field hockey. They were all field hockey events. And when you look at the gender policies of the governing bodies for these 6 sports, the International Hockey Federation had the most well-defined gender policies of them all. So it probably isn't much of a coincidence. Just a little bit of description on the events. The events were organized in more venues and more cities when they were men's events. But that's not necessarily outrageous when you take into account the fact that there are usually more participating teams for men's events than for women's events. So the idea that there are more venues or more cities makes sense, right? It falls directly under that line. But what I really wanted to investigate was the size of the potential audience. So that means, what kind of cities are you organizing the competitions in? And then, what kind of venues are you organizing them in, right? So, when we look at the host cities, average population, if you look, the men's competitions, the men's events, were organized in much bigger cities on average than women's events. If you look at all competitions from 2.2 million to 1.9 million, let's say, there's a 17% difference here between women and men, women's competitions and men's competitions. And again, handball and volleyball were the two that had like the direct opposite, with more bigger cities for women's events. And again, if you look at the gender policies of these 6 governing bodies, these 2 sports are the only 2 sports out of the 6 in terms of governing bodies that don't make a difference in their gender policies between men, in their policies between men and women. They just talk about athletes in general. They don't make a difference. They don't really talk about anything like that. Whereas basketball, football, and rugby talk about trying to get gender equity, but they never define it, unlike field hockey. And they actually do make a difference because they mention it, right? If we look at the venues, and I'll just go straight to the colored slide. If we look at the venues, same thing, similar results. The venue, the men's competitions are organized in much, much larger venues than the women's competitions. So for basketball, that's a 36% difference between women's events and men's events. The worst 2 are definitely, are definitely football and rugby. Let me go back, there we go. Are definitely football and rugby. And football, the men's competitions are organized in venues that are 95% bigger than the women's competitions. And in rugby, it's 144%, which is more than double. It's huge. It's 2.5 times what they have in women's events. And so actually the other thing I found interesting was in terms of continents, the Americas and Europe are by far the worst. They organize competitions, and they're continental competitions in much smaller venues for women than they do for men. So we always think of, Europe and sometimes like Western civilizations as leading when it comes to gender advancement. But that's hard evidence that that's not necessarily true, at least in the world of sports. And again, rugby and football are by far the worst. If you kind of delve by sport, I didn't include anything more detailed because I thought I would have only 10 minutes. But yeah, if you look by sport, rugby and football are by far the worst. And the same results in terms of continents, same results for city populations. The Americas and Europe organize their women's sports competitions in much smaller cities than their men's sports competitions. So here's an example that I wanted to kind of like give as concrete to make it more real for you guys. So we have I'm French, by the way, I was born and raised in France. The Euro 2016 was in France, which is the European Championship of Nations. And the Women's World Cup, so that's for men, and the Women's World Cup was in France this past summer. So we're talking a 3-year difference here, right? These are the cities that were for each competition. On the left, you have the Euro 2016. On the right, you have the Women's World Cup. And if you look at, so the list in the middle, in blue are the stadiums that were used. So by the way, that list is the 12 biggest stadiums in France. 12 biggest stadiums in France for soccer, period. Well, which is the 12 biggest stadiums in France, period, actually. Because soccer is the most popular sport, right? So the 12 biggest stadiums in red are the ones that were used for both competitions. In blue are the ones that were used for the Euro 2016 only. And in gray, the ones that weren't used for either competition. And so you can see clearly that for the Euro 2016, they used 10 of the top 12 stadiums in France. For the Women's World Cup in 2019, they used only 3. And it wasn't even for that many games when you actually looked. They went to Le Havre, Reims, Valenciennes, those cities in the north, Grenoble, all those cities are not necessarily they're accessible. You have trains, but you don't have that many. When the US played in Reims, on the top right, R-E-I-M-S, the trains were sold out. The trains were totally sold out. In terms of transportation, we didn't have what we needed for this competition. And Marseille, which is the second biggest city in France and the second biggest stadium, was not used. Saint-Denis, which is the biggest stadium in France, was not used at all for the women's competition. And same thing with prices, right? On the one hand, for the Euro 2016, to go to both semifinals and the final, you had to fork out at least 215 euros, and that was exactly the maximum amount that you could spend on the semifinals and the final for the Women's World Cup. And that's not to say that they should be equal, right? Like, that would be misleading because the women's game is not as popular. But then there's a difference between paying a small fraction of the price or paying a decent price. Like, I had a lot of friends who jumped on those 50 euro packages and then ended up not traveling because they couldn't, but it was just 50 euros, so even if they lost it, whatever. So they're constantly underestimating the women's game here. So just as a conclusion, going back to the beginning, we need to make more effort, like we need to have the federations make more effort to sell women's sports as major events.
Thank you very much, Roxane. Thank you very much indeed. And so obviously we will discuss the topic in greater detail in a few minutes. Because now Karissa will talk about, we'll basically discuss, we'll examine bodies through a machine body framework, so think of bodies as machines, and so in a way, if in Karissa's opinion bodies are machines, I suppose Roxane just talked about racetracks. Karissa, the floor is yours, and you can stay there or come here, whatever works best for you.
I'll just sit here. So welcome, thanks for being here. Roxane took a fairly macro look at issues related to gender, and I'm going to take a much more micro look at those issues. I won't be speaking explicitly about gender in this presentation, but I will be speaking about bodies, so the conversation of gender then inherently follows fairly closely. Over the past 2 days, we've heard quite a bit about the important role of ethics committees in challenging corruption in sport and providing protection to athletes, both at the elite level and at the collegiate and the youth level. There remain, though, some issues that, though inherently ethical, are not governed as explicitly by national or international policy. Specifically, today I'll be talking to you about the gray areas that surround bodies, including the knowledge, I'm going to use quotes here, knowledge about those bodies and how we treat those bodies. For those of you who made it to the Castor-Semenya panel last night, know that certainly bodies are policed, and I don't mean to imply that they're not. Bodies are absolutely regulated in sport, and Castor-Semenya and other athletes with varying levels of testosterone are certainly testament to that. However, generally, the kind of regulation that we see in those cases and in other cases is put in place when governing bodies deem there to be a threat to fairness in competition, or a threat to the historical and social status quo. I'm taking a fairly critical approach here. There's far less regulation when it comes to the short and particularly long-term health of athletes. As a PhD student studying communication specifically, I'm interested in how truths and knowledge, there are those air quotes again, about bodies come to be, and how the role that communication plays in constructing that knowledge. And reproducing that knowledge, of course. So today, specifically, I'll be talking about one salient communication occurrence in sport, namely the metaphor of the athlete body as machine. I'll discuss how this metaphor and the knowledge surrounding it leads to unique challenges for athletes and other members of the sport environment, and may ultimately impact social well-being or physical and mental health. So it'll first be important for me to define some of the terms that I'll be using. I'm coming from communication and not from sports management or generally the fields that are more involved in this kind of scholarship. So I'm just going to define some terms. First, I'll be talking about a modernist versus a postmodernist tradition. So when I say a modernist tradition, I mean a research tradition rooted in scientific, objective methods. This tradition holds that there's one truth out there and that we can discover that truth using tools like the scientific method. Pretty standard modernist tradition. I, though, am a postmodernist, and I could spend my time today, even with the extra time, 10 times over trying to define what postmodernism is, but I will spare you on that for today. What is going to be important to take away in terms of what is postmodernism is this. Postmodern theory holds that knowledge is produced and reproduced through discourse, and that, importantly, knowledge isn't neutral, but instead reflects the interests of those in power, socially and historically. So despite decades of postmodern scholarship, this thing that I'm referring to as discourse is still a fairly abstract concept. Discourse can be behavioral, it can be linguistic, it can show up in the form of silence, certainly. Today I'll be talking about a linguistic form of discourse, specifically the metaphor of the athlete body as machine. So sometimes we see this metaphor explicitly stated, like in this track and field news cover featuring Dennis Mitchell from '94, or in a FanBuzz article that I have kind of given a little excerpt from here on Megan Rapinoe that says, they know Megan Rapinoe as a goal-scoring machine. So sometimes this metaphor, like in these examples, is explicitly stated, but more often than not, we see this metaphor come up in the language that we use to describe athlete bodies. So if an athlete's performing well, we say something like, the wheels are really turning. And if an athlete's performance maybe doesn't meet our expectations, we say things like, they're a little rusty today, or they broke down, or they ran out of steam. When athletes need to recover, we say things like they need to refuel or they need a tune-up. All of this language relies on this metaphor of the athlete body being a machine. When we talk about machines here, we are talking about something that's composed of reproducible and replaceable parts capable of mechanical failure. Unfortunately, this kind of idea about the body ignores some really important things about human bodies, namely that they're not just bodies, that they're social beings, and that they are not necessarily athletes in isolation, right? So an important thing to note. So although many of you being involved in sport are probably familiar with this metaphor and kind of the language like the examples that I've given, it's still important to recognize that it's been well documented in the literature. So scholars have traced this rationalization of the body to the Renaissance, during which time the human body started to be explained in mathematical terms. During the Enlightenment, Descartes popularized Cartesian ideas of a mind-body split. I don't know if there are any philosophers in the room, but yeah, we're getting into some more philosophy here. Others yet reference theories of thermodynamics, which equate mechanical energy with caloric energy. The idea of a body as an energy producer and energy transformer is certainly still present and utilized in endurance training and testing, specifically tests of aerobic strength and maximum aerobic speed, such as VO2 max testing. I echo the many scholars who came before me to say that these ideas and these depictions, among other things, laid the groundwork for and continues to inform the current sports science paradigm, which sees the body as a machine that is more or less efficient, and that's certainly a very modernist kind of approach to understanding bodies. So at this point, I don't think there are any communication people in the room. So at this point, you might be saying, Karissa, it's just language. They're just words. To that, I would echo my whole field to say that nothing is just language, right? In their formative work on metaphor, for example, scholars like Hoff and Johnson argue that the human conceptual system is fundamentally metaphorical in character. Metaphorical concepts, they argue, reflect and reproduce cultural experience, and therefore are essential to our knowledge and experiences of reality and truth. This kind of theorizing is consistent with Post-Modernism and suggests that language is anything but neutral. Rather, discourse like the athlete body as machine metaphor is inherently modernist in that it assumes the body is an object, one that can be observed and manipulated. Oh, went that way, sorry. So to quote Seagrave from 97, by likening athletes to machines and the results of the athletic endeavor to productivity, we seek to attain mortality. But in doing so, we depersonalize the athlete, both male and female. This kind of depersonalization may seem inconsequential or even trivial. However, I argue that when we quantify bodies, athletes suffer. When we liken athletes to machines, something strange happens, and sport ceases to be about the athlete and becomes instead fixated on the result, or literally the products that athlete is able to turn out. In this way, the athlete is at once a machine in itself, churning out product, but is also a cog in the corporate machine that is the sport industry. So in some of the panels that we've heard this morning, we've heard talk about money, right? In 2015, Forbes projected that the American sports industry would be worth $73.5 billion by this year. It's become overwhelmingly clear that sport, like any other industry, is first and foremost a capitalist enterprise. This industry, though, survives and thrives on the performance of human bodies, leading to conditions which enable and encourage the exploitation of those bodies. Certainly, these ideas are nothing new. We have a whole field of sociology of sport that looks at issues like this. To quote Sage from 1990, high-performance sport has increasingly become a project in human engineering, whose objective is producing levels of performance with seemingly little understanding of, or even interest in, what the consequences may be for personal and social development of the athlete. There's a huge amount of scholarship in this area, but what continues to be under-theorized is how this manifests at the local level, at the interpersonal level. Without an understanding of what this looks like on the ground, athletes will continue to find themselves in compromising positions, which threaten their health and wellness, as well as their abilities to compete. So in my dissertation project, I'm hoping to expand theory in those ways, but in the meantime, let's think about an example. So consider a female cross-country runner. I ran track and field in college, so I'm considering some of my teammates here. This athlete is moving into her junior year and hopes to continue her career after college. She knows that many of her competitors and even teammates engage in some unhealthy eating habits, dropping weight in order to drop time, and it seems to work for them. Sure, there's a risk of injury, maybe a pelvic stress fracture, which she knows is common among female runners, but she just can't help but imagine how much faster she might be if she were leaner or lighter. After all, it's now or never, junior year of college, right? And isn't sport about discipline and control anyway? Those are questions that we might ask. Although this is a hypothetical scenario, it's a realistic one. Research suggests that disordered eating is a significant problem for athletes. In fact, recent reports suggest that prevalence rates for eating disorders among female athletes may be as high as 62%, as reported by the National Eating Disorder Association. Prevention and treatment efforts have focused on educating athletes and other members of the sport environment of the risks and consequences of disordered eating. However, treatment seeking for disordered eating behavior remains low. I'm just going to say it, athletes aren't dumb. The risks of disordered eating are salient in sport. But sports, like we've said, is a unique place. This culture is characterized by coach, teammate, and mass communication, which is all influenced by discourse, like the machine body metaphor. When the body is constructed as a machine liable to be replaced, or a cog in the corporate mechanism, which is American sport, athletes are forced to engage in some cognitive and behavioral gymnastics. In a study that I conducted in 2018, I keep forgetting which way to point this thing, I found that athletes recognize two truths about disordered eating. The clinical truth, which emphasizes the health consequences of disordered eating, and the local truth, which emphasizes the potential performance enhancements from such behavior. The athletes I interviewed seemed to struggle with how to manage the tension between these two truths, because how do you reconcile them, right? This gets even more complex when we expand from knowledge to norms. Disordered eating itself is constructed in this space as both normative and deviant, and we see the same pattern with treatment seeking. This is a slippery phenomenon which has thus far been constrained by modernist ideology. It's no wonder issues like this persist. Researchers, physicians, and political bodies have by and large ignored the locally emergent truths about disordered eating and other issues like this, looking to the clinical ideas about disordered eating as the truth, as the one source of knowledge to draw on. It is Orwellian doublethink. We are gaslighting our athletes. So I'm running close on time here, but let's just return to our hypothetical scenario really quick. Suppose that our female distance runner were to reject disordered eating behaviors. She may at the same time be applauded for attending to her health and discredited for not doing whatever it takes to produce the goods. If she were to engage in disordered eating behaviors, she may at the same time be praised for her performance and dedication and shamed for her behavior clinically deemed deviant. If she were then to seek treatment, she may at the same time be condemned for her strength, or commended for her strength, and ridiculed for suggesting that this behavior is something that needs to be stopped. So, to conclude, the threat of obsolescence, whether in the form of removal from play or failure to perform at the necessary level, looms large for athletes, especially those hoping to continue their careers at the elite level. Research tells us that the athletic identity is hugely important to athletes' overall sense of self, and that for some, sport is the key to social and financial well-being. So for these athletes, that creates a predicament. For those athletes, when it comes down to unhealthy behavior versus the end of a career, it isn't really a choice, right? It's not really a choice. So this is just one example of many that I could have discussed today. In fact, we've hardly scratched the surface. We could have a similar conversation about doping or about sexual abuse. We haven't even begun to consider the role of gender, sexuality, race, or ability, but those are all conversations for a different day. So thank you so much for your attention, and I would love to chat more about it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Karissa, and indeed, this deserves an applause. We have about 20 minutes for questions, comments, and discussion. Who wants to start? Who will be the brave one? Yes, please.
My name is
Yes, let's bring the microphone forward, please, because we are recording, and the hundreds of people who will be watching this for posterity will appreciate it.
Thousands.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Emanuela. I come from Italy, and it was interesting your Roxane, because in Italy in this moment, strange, but there is more attention to the women soccer because I don't know, maybe because the Italian men is worse in this moment because they have changed many athletes. And after the World Championship, will change the more attention and media and sponsor at the TV, and was very good situation. And I ask you if the problem of the women team soccer, basketball is only for because the events they are in the same time as the men, so there is no view first, or there is a problem with the money because they don't want to spend enough money. What's the problem?
Yeah, great questions. So the first one, a lot of the events are actually not at the same time. I was looking, a lot of them are actually 1 year apart, or a few months apart. So like in rugby, sometimes it's like, you know, in you have some events that are in the fall for women and in the spring for men. So they're actually not at the same time, which, you know, means that rugby fans could potentially go into women's rugby, but that has to be marketed, right? So I was trying to pull up here during the Women's World Cup this summer, TF1, which is a major broadcaster in France, and it had the television rights of all the French games and several, like all the major games, which of course if you're in France that includes the French national team's games. After a couple of games aired, they realized they had underestimated the ad rate. And they, like literally for halftime, their ads went up 61%. Like, it is ridiculous to underestimate it that much, right? And so it comes from, despite the growth of women's sports, which is undeniable over the past 10, 15 years. If you look at football in Italy and France, it's so much bigger than it used to be.
Is the first sport, the soccer?
Right, but it's grown for women as well, right? Like in the 90s, the French Federation, the Italian Federation gave absolutely no support to women. Now they do, and it paid off. Like Italy actually went to the playoffs this year in the Women's World Cup, which was not expected. But so the same thing happened in the U.S., and that's what I'm trying to pull up, but I may not be able to find it. The marketers in the U.S. for this Women's World Cup this past summer also completely underestimated how much money they could make from that tournament. So I actually wrote it down, I really liked when Karissa said, sports is first and foremost a capitalist and enterprise. It is, except for women. They don't try to make money off of those women's events. They frame them constantly, they show them as family events. So, you know, I went to both the Euro 2016 in France and the Women's World Cup this past summer. Concession prices were different. Like, if I remember correctly, a water bottle during the Euro 2016 was €7, and this summer at the Women's World Cup it was €4. They're not even trying to make money. €3 this summer. So they're not even trying to make money like they're trying to do with men. They're not trying to invest like they are with men. And without investment, you know, what's the saying in English? Like, if you don't invest, like, you have to invest to make money or something like that. You have to spend money to make money. They don't do that with women's sports. Did that answer both your questions? Did I miss one?
Yeah. Can I add something to that? That's really interesting, and this just occurred to me, that it really becomes like a chicken and egg kind of scenario where the argument is that women's sports don't make money, and so why invest in women's sports? But then that money isn't invested in order to make the money, and so it's cyclical. Yeah.
And I mean, what's interesting too. So yesterday I actually went online to look at the 1930. I don't know. Soccer is my favorite sport, so that like it's the easiest for me to use soccer examples, football examples. But 1930 was the first World Cup in sports, like the first FIFA accredited World Cup in football. It was in Uruguay in 1930, so almost 100 years ago. The stadiums, there were 3 main stadiums at the time, and one of them was bigger than 7 or 8 of the stadiums that were used this past year for the Women's World Cup, which has officially existed for FIFA since 95 or 91, depending on how you decide to analyze history. And so it's been in existence for more than 20 years. And yet, like the stadiums, like a lot of the stadiums that were used are actually smaller than the main stadium that was used in 1930 for the first ever World Cup for men. So the investment is just not there. They're just not investing.
I will cut the line with a little bit provocative question, perhaps provocative question for both of you. Given the consequences of conceiving sport as a capitalist enterprise, in other words, given all the other presentations that we listen to at this conference, which are largely reflect the consequence of sport being deemed a capitalist enterprise, is the fact that sport is not yet considered a capitalist enterprise necessarily bad?
The fact that sports is not considered
apologies, the fact that women's sports, that women's competitions are not considered a capitalist enterprise, is that necessarily bad?
Do you want to start? Or should I?
You go for it.
Okay.
I have some thoughts, but you go first.
I mean, I think like everything else in life, it's got some good in it and some bad, right? The bad thing is female athletes have a lot fewer opportunities and chances to live freely their lives as athletes. Like if you, and we don't even have to think about like making money. Like if you think about immigration, right? If you want to immigrate to the US, for instance, right? Like you want to immigrate to the US, I'm going to talk about this country because I immigrated to this country, so I know the rules better than any other, right? So if you immigrate to the US, there's a visa called the athlete, well, it's nicknamed the athlete visa. It's the O visa. You have to be able to make a living from your sport in order to qualify for this. What female athlete can do that? Not a lot. Male athletes, on the other hand, have a lot more chances. Even in minor leagues, they can, you know, they don't even have to be like in baseball. They don't have to be in the MLB. They can be in minor leagues and still prove that they can make a living from their salary. Whereas in the WNBA, which is the major league for women, some of them don't make enough money. In the NWSL, the major league for soccer, some of them are paid like $10,000 or $12,000 a year. You can't live off of that, so you don't qualify for that visa, right? So there's a lot of bad, but then there's a lot of good because hopefully there's less corruption. There's definitely some good in there.
Yeah, what I would say is tying it back to health. Certainly capitalism is bad. I think that's not too big of a hot take. Like we can be critical of capitalism as a structural kind of institution. But the fact of the matter is that we live in a capitalist society, right? And those athletes still need to make money for reasons like you described, and also just just living a comfortable life, making a life. So I would argue that we can be critical of capitalism. We can be critical of the fact that sport is a capitalist enterprise, while at the same time recognizing that money is important to athletes. And if athletes are not making the money that they need to live a comfortable life or to provide for themselves and their families, that might put athletes in a compromising position where they're, exploited or willing to maybe do things that are a threat to their health or their well-being in order to make that money and in order to provide for their families. So,
and actually, I'm not arguing further that. Thank you for making me think of this. But the fact that women's sports are so low in the pyramid, if I can use that metaphor, are a direct result of sports as a capitalist enterprise.
Yep.
Right? it's the whole, that's what you see in society with, you know, the middle class disappearing, the rich people getting richer and the poor people getting poorer. Like, the exact same thing is happening in sports. So you have astronomical amounts of money and resources for, you know, soccer, like football, American football here in the US, football in Europe and South America, but then all the other minor sports are kind of disappearing. I mean, of course they still exist, but you don't see them, it's hard to find them, it's hard to access them, and that's definitely a direct result of sports as a capitalist enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions or comments? Yeah?
Hi, thanks for sharing your work. My question is for Karissa. My husband is a Purdue grad.
Oh,
So
excellent.
boiler up.
Boiler up.
But I know you just scratched the surface with your research and what you had explained, and I absolutely agree with you that language is critical in the way we construct situations and how how society views things.
Yeah.
But jumping from scratching the surface to solution-based,
Yeah.
what are your recommendations to shift that narrative?
Sure. This is a question I get fairly often. I certainly don't mean to imply that more regulations is the answer. So more policing of athlete bodies, specifically female bodies or black bodies or other bodies. I wouldn't say that that's the answer. Certainly those regulations from a postmodern perspective, because again, I'm a postmodernist, would likely, given social and historical institutions, reflect the interests of those who are already in power, right? So we have regulations on, for example, Caster Semenya for the middle distances claim not to be targeted, but fairly obvious that those may be targeted. So I do think that we, though, can take a critical look at the way that at the interpersonal level we talk about these issues, and just not even, I get this question a lot, is what's the answer? How can we change it? And it's so entrenched, right? It's so entrenched in sports culture, and sports culture is so entrenched in, American culture, but also globally. So I think that I would take a bottom-up approach. Certainly, it's not the responsibility of athletes to take that on, but I'll quote Audre Lorde for the critical scholars in the room: you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. So I do think we need to start at the interpersonal level, being critical of the way that we describe bodies, the way that we talk about bodies, in youth sport, in high school sports, in college sports, before we even get to that elite or Olympic level. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It does, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Who wants to go next?
Hello, I'm Maria from Serbia. I just want to ask for your comment regarding something that took my attention like a few weeks or months before, and that's a report from the NBA and FLA that there will be no cheerleaders anymore present during the game. So there was a lot of comment about the reasons for that. So somebody says, it can go with your story actually. And I truly respect them. I think that they are totally professional athlete regarding the training and everything. So I think that people maybe got misunderstanding with what is actually the reason that there is no longer cheerleaders for the most famous game in NBA, for example. So what is your comment on that?
That's a really good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm going to get theoretical, and then we'll bring it back down to the practical level. So we know that historically, as we've discussed, women's sports are underrepresented, underfinanced, underrespected in a larger sense. I didn't hear about that, and I didn't hear some of the reasons that were given. But I imagine that at least some of those reasons were framed as a way to either empower women or bring attention to the men on the court or on the field, right? coming from a postmodern background, certainly I can think of ways that those issues might be framed that certainly just kind of reflect the status quo, which is, you know, the same status quo that we hear with dress codes and things like that. Like, we don't want to distract the men, where the onus is then put on women to do that labor. So again, I'm unfamiliar with that, but I would say that you know, we need to look critically at what knowledge, quote unquote, I'll go back to that, what knowledge is coming out of the discourse surrounding that decision, and how that knowledge, those truths, I'm going to put it in quotes, reflect kind of the interests of those who are already in power and who have historically had that power. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Anyway, it's interesting for me, so I just want to ask you what is your opinion.
So I have a little bit of a different take, but well, I totally agree with what Karissa said. But I would add as well, and Simon may be able, because he knows basketball a lot more than I do, but if the cheerleaders in the NBA were paid as much as the cheerleaders in the NFL, which is the National Football League, American football here in the US, the way I see it, it's kind of a way to, so cheerleaders in the NFL are paid by the hour while they're at the game actually cheering. They are not paid for their training, like their practices. They're not paid for anything else, right? So they make no money. They, like, a lot of them don't make enough money to actually live, right? And so if in the NBA it's the same thing, do you know if it's the same thing?
I'm not sure.
Okay. I don't know if it's the same thing in the NBA, but if it is, to me it's just another way to just, we don't want to actually give them a living wage, so we're just going to get rid of it, and we're going to frame that, we're going to say that that's because we don't want to objectify women.
Yes.
I'm not sure that that's the real reason. That's definitely the PR reason. It's a great public relations reason. It's like a politically accepted way of saying this. But my guess is they just don't want to pay them.
Well, I mean,
Thank you.
and if I may just expand a little bit on this question, and my guess is, you might be right, my guess is that dancers, cheerleaders in the NBA probably received slightly higher salaries, but that was also probably on account of the NBA season being considerably longer, so 41 home games rather than
That's
8
true.
or 9 home games. I mean, and granted, the expectation, at least for NFL cheerleaders, and perhaps even for cheerleaders in other sports, was that this would be a good opportunity for them to gain exposure, and so to perhaps make a living and gain notoriety or gain professional opportunities for being a Seagal or a Laker girl and so on. Some NFL teams have actually not had dancers or cheerleaders since at least the 1970s. Green Bay Packers, Pittsburgh Steelers have not had cheerleaders at all, and at least the Green Bay Packers are, in NFL terms, a very popular franchise for governance reasons, actually. A couple of years ago, there were some controversies, also based on an interesting and insightful New York Times report regarding cheerleaders in some teams being exploited and yes, being paid a very low wage. Cheerleaders in other sport, in at least one other team, being exploited in a different way, as in objectified and even encouraged to serve as escorts, I suppose. And so I think this is why between these, the Me Too, time is up, the kind of spirit of the times, as far as the NFL is concerned, and the NBA trying to present itself as a very progressive league, and they're trying to build this into their overall image. I'm guessing this is why these two particular leagues, I'm guessing this is why these leagues are moving away from let's say, cheerleaders. Those of you who are familiar with the American university level probably already know that there are, in the United States, in the college system, they're not called cheerleaders, they are the spirit squad, and they have incorporated male dancers, acrobats, gymnasts, and so on for a long time, and it is probably somewhat differently conceived. Something like that. It's a sign of the times. Times perhaps are changing.
Throwing Bush for the cheerleader.
Anyway, I like to see them, so I'm pretty sad about that. Because I totally respect them as an athlete, not as a girl sport that would give us some kind of fun. Yeah.
And I'll say this just because it's going down for posterity. There are a couple of NFL teams out there that, because that New York Times article and a bunch of other media coverage stories came out, there are a couple of NFL teams that now pay their cheerleaders for training time as well. I mean, it's still low hourly wage, but at least it's more hours.
We have time for, thank you, Maria. We have time for perhaps one question left. And if not, I will make a very quick question or a short question that hopefully our two presenters can answer relatively quickly. What is better, seeing that you provided great content in a large room with modest attendance. So what is best? To provide great content in a small room that is full? Or is it great to play, let's say, a championship in a large venue that will sit largely empty, like it happened for the recent IAA or World Athletics Championships in Doha, which were also criticized for being staged in front of a largely empty stadium. So what is best? You can each have your own opinion, of course.
I think that Roxane's presentation really speaks to that. So, do you want to take it first?
I think that, of course, it is. Well, I would think that it is probably better to be in a smaller venue that's full. However, women's soccer could fill bigger stadium. If 20 years ago they could fill like 90,000, like a 90,000 people stadium, there is no reason that today, considering it's way more popular than it was back then, that it can't fill bigger stadiums, right? And so the thing is, I think that we have to take a chance. We have to invest and just hope for the best. I mean, the athletics in Doha, that was more about the heat and the everything else. And surprisingly, it did not keep, like we knew it would happen. It did not keep them from organizing it there, right? So I think there are other forces at work that have nothing to do with that idea of, I don't want to play in front of an empty stadium. In France, I'm also a big ice hockey fan. France hosted the Ice Hockey World Championship a couple of years back, and that was a big deal for me. I went home for that, and the arena was not that. It was the men's championship, by the way. The arena was pretty empty, and yet they still organized it in the biggest arena in France, right? Would they have done that for the women's hockey world championship? No, they did not. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think you did something really interesting comparing this panel to women's sports. I don't know if you did that on purpose, but I think that we can say similar things for both, right? Like Roxane said, we need to sell women's sport as a big event, and in that way, we need to hold those events at these bigger stadiums, even if it's just for PR, even if it doesn't pull that crowd, to illustrate that women's sports are a big event. Similarly here, we have, and I was explaining to these guys earlier that my presentation didn't necessarily fall into one of the conference themes, but this, ideas like these, things that aren't regulated by governing bodies necessarily, don't get as much attention at events like this, which is totally fine and legitimate, but it's also important to bring those ideas up, even though they are maybe not at the forefront of everyone's mind. And have a big room. Show that this is a big event. That's one tangible thing that we can do, right? You ask for tangible things. We can make decisions like this to try our best to illustrate that this is an important thing to talk about, yeah.
And the room's not the biggest, by the way. We're not in the big room.
Room size number 5 on the list of wanted to Hopefully we provided you with good value. Thank you very much for coming. Let's give them a round of applause, please. And it is time for lunch. Enjoy lunch, and then we continue with the program at 2:15. Have a good afternoon, have a good rest of the day, and have a good rest of the conference.
Thank you, Simon.
Yeah, thanks.